What they're saying piety is a kind of anti-religion. No incense, no sacrifices, only gratitude, like only the contemplation of the pure mind, and vegetarianism. So it sounds almost Pythagorean in nature.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are very excited to talk about theoretical Hermeticism with scholars and translators Dan Attrell and Dr. David Porreca. Quid est Deus? What is God? For centuries, ancient and medieval philosophers have wrestled among themselves with all manner of questions regarding the first cause of things, the nature of divinity, and man's role in the created cosmos. In the Latin West, following the collapse of the Roman Empire, whether among pagan philosophers or Christian theologians alike, the answers to such questions were of the utmost importance. Since the late antique period, many of these ideas were ultimately distilled and transmitted not so much by texts known today as practical hermetica, those astro-magical and theurgical texts like the Picatrix that we're all so familiar with here on the Glitch Bottle podcast, but by what we call theoretical hermetica, philosophical and theological works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, among various other ancient sages, whose primary goals were to elucidate the nature and relationship of the one true God and the human soul. These texts were not, as many popular narratives like to imagine, suppressed, ignored, and forgotten by Christians during the Middle Ages. On the contrary, the texts we'll be discussing today were frequently copied, commented upon with numerous glosses, and some were even used as textbooks with which to teach budding university theologians about the conclusions of the ancients in regards to all matters divine. Today we will be discussing a handful of Hermetic texts that were unique to the Latin world, that is, texts attributed to Hermes with no extant analogues in Greek or Arabic. Chief among these texts are the Latin Asclepius by Pseudo-Apuleius, its 13th century commentary, the Glossae Super Trismegistum, the Book of 24 Philosophers, plus scholastic medieval commentaries, and the De Sex Rerum Principis, on the 6 principles of things, all of which stand today as rich repositories of various late antique and medieval Platonic philosophical ideas, in particular, those in the line of Proclus. Until now, only the Asclepius has been translated out of all of these texts, and today I'll be discussing the whole lot of them with 2 of the 4 translators assembled by Breppel's Hermes Latinus series. We have Dan Attrell, intellectual historian, classicist, and doctoral candidate in medieval and Renaissance history at the University of Waterloo, also known on the internet as the Modern Hermeticist, alongside his co-translator and doctoral supervisor, Dr. David Porreca, associate professor of classics, co-director of the Medieval Studies program at the University of Waterloo, and a specialist in Latin Hermetica. Their upcoming translations for Breppels, along with the help of Brett Bartlett and Mark Delp, who himself is working specifically on the De Sex Rerum Principis, are set to be released to the world near the end of 2022. But here, right now, this is the perfect chance to have Dan and David share about these important works, what the heck theoretical Hermetica is, and why it's so important, as well as discuss medieval esotericism, philosophy, and Latin philology in general. And also, as always, thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron for your support and excellent questions for Dan Attrell and Dr. David Porreca. The podcast would not be possible without you. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Dan Attrell and Dr. David Porreca. Dan Attrell and Dr. David Porreca, thank you both so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thanks for having us, Alex.
Thanks for having us, indeed.
Oh, it is such an honor to have both of you on here at the same time. And I was actually thinking about this, that in a sense, You both are kind of like the dynamic duo because many listeners are familiar with your translation of and commentary on the Latin sources of the Picatrix in 2019 from Penn State University Press. And you both are in the written sphere coming together again, along with others, with these new translations of the theoretical Hermetic texts. But before we get to all of that, how did you two meet and how did you first get acquainted with each other?
David, do you want to do this or should I do it?
Yeah, sure. I can give it a whirl and you can fill in the gaps. Dan started as an MA student at the University of Waterloo in our master's program that at the time was known as Ancient Mediterranean Cultures, and I was his supervisor at that point. And I had hatched in the back of my mind and partially complete at that point the Picatrix translation, but I also was becoming heavily involved in university administration at the time, becoming faculty association president, which sort of put my pace of work, my capacity to keep the pace of the work up, dampened it quite a bit. So Dan was instrumental in sort of kicking me into gear and providing the excuse to actually finish the project, and his contributions were plenty substantial to warrant the full co-authorship. And we've been working together ever since. We have another translation underway for University of Toronto Press as well, which is less involved with esoterica. It's one of Marsilio Ficino's polemical works, Christian polemical works. But more relevant to this podcast is this third project of ours, which is the Hermes Latinus translation. Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think that was back in 2011 when we first met.
Yeah.
And then I spent 2 years studying under you, and then I left for UCLA for 2 years, and then came back to Waterloo years later as a PhD student in the history department. And David is one of my co-supervisors, and we've been working together for the last 4 years, I guess, on various projects almost nonstop. So it's been quite good. We have another partner that we work with, Brett Bartlett, who some of you may be familiar with. He's been like on Encyclopedia Hermetica, and he is our resident, classical guy. He really is good at the classical stuff. And so he's not so interested in medieval Latin. It drives him nuts. Like it literally makes him go crazy. But his help is indispensable, especially on, for example, the Asclepius, which is, of course, a classical Latin work, not a medieval Latin work. And we can get into that later. But he's not here. He's at work. He works on Saturdays, so he couldn't be with us. But I will carry his voice where it becomes relevant.
Brett is also a graduate from the master's program at Waterloo in classics.
Yes.
So that's how all of us got to meet.
Yes. And also, Doctor, you know more about Mark Delp than I do.
Right. Mark Delp did his PhD at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And his PhD was on the treatise De Sex Rerum Principiis. He provided a critical edition of that text for the dissertation, and then was involved in producing the published critical edition as part of the Brepols Hermes Latinus series, along with Paolo Lucentini, who was the founder of the series, the late Paolo Lucentini, I should say. And Mark, we're very happy that he's willing to pick up his own baton, so to speak, and sort of tie a bow around that project that's been a lifetime project for him, really. He's done all sorts of other things in the meantime, but he just recently retired from a college in California and is now in a position to take up this piece of work and finalize it as one of 4 parts of this theoretical Hermetica volume of translations that should be appearing through Brepols late next year, ideally.
Dr. Porreca, too, something Dan shared about in previous episodes of the podcast is just, kind of his early immersion in esotericism and Hermetica. How did you, Dr. Porreca, first become interested in medieval studies? Is there anything that you can share with us?
Yeah, I can. It goes back to a pair of novels by Umberto Eco from the 1980s. The one I read first was Foucault's Pendulum, but I also read The Name of the Rose, which is the more famous of the two. Both of them are works of historical fiction that have to do with the Middle Ages, written by Umberto Eco, the medievalist, who is arguably more famous for his novels than for his scholarship. But he's also the inventor of the entire field of semiotics in philosophy. But those 2 books were catalysts, I would say, in terms of piquing my interest. I was at the time intending to go into planetary astronomy. But the interest that those books elicited in me were sufficient to get me to change my mind on that. And so here we are. And it's just as well, I was hoping to work with Carl Sagan at Cornell, but he passed away the year I would have been doing my master's in science. So I would have missed the boat on that anyway. So it's just as well that fate has turned out this way.
The project that you're undertaking, multiple translations with, as you mentioned, Brett Bartlett and Mark Delp. All of this centers, Dr. Porreca and Dan, on theoretical hermetica. And I know that so many listeners are familiar, of course, with practical hermetica, but can each of you kind of share your own definition and take on what is theoretical hermetica and how does it contrast with practical hermetica?
Simply put, theoretical hermetica is mostly philosophical or theological in nature. In the case of the Asclepius, we have like a vision of the whole cosmos, a map of kind of everything there is, from the one to the many and the souls in between and the world soul. And we have a description of how the elements operate and a description of the great chain of being, of reincarnation, souls coming back, going into animals or ascending into higher states. We have the famous passage about God making. Why is it that humans have the ability to essentially create gods, or at least create the images of gods, to channel the gods in the intellectual world? And then we also have the Lament of Hermes, which I think probably most people are familiar with, the story about the end of paganism, essentially, in Egypt, and what kind of ramifications that would have on the cosmos that is Egypt. And so this is what the Asclepius deals with. And then when we have something like the Book of 24 Philosophers, or the commentary on the Asclepius, the Glossae Super Trismegistum, these are more, I would say, philosophical, but, theology and philosophy interpenetrate each other. So these are more scholastic in nature, and they are intended to provide, at least the Book of 24 Philosophers provides aphorisms about what is God. And it is a collection of allegedly 24 philosophers' various definitions. It's traditionally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. So we call it Hermetica. That's the simple nominalist definition of Hermeticism. What makes a text hermetic is that it contains, or an attribution to, Hermes Trismegistus. It's hard to say exactly what it is other than philosophy and theology, whereas the practical hermetica is more instructions on building talismans and harvesting plant matter and resins and so on and so forth, in order that they might be used for ceremonial magic purposes. David, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I can add something, in the sense that the manner in which the two groups of texts have been transmitted is also quite distinct, in that the vast majority, if not all, of the theoretical hermetica arrived in the Western tradition via Arabic, as compared to the theoretical material that survives through the Latin and Western tradition itself. The Asclepius, the text, was written in Greek in the 1st or 2nd century AD and translated into Latin sometime in the 4th century, and survives in numerous manuscripts, the oldest of which is from the early 9th century. The Book of 24 Philosophers appears on the scene in the 12th century, but seems to be a collection of garbled, late antique theorizing about divinity, as Dan was describing. And the Book of Six Principles, the Liber de Sex Rerum Principiis, is also the product of the 12th century and has no real antecedents to it prior to that, other than quoting from ancient materials. But so these works are circulating separately from the theoretical hermetica, and what they have in common is the attribution to Hermes and not much else.
And lots of manuscripts.
Mm-hmm. For the Asclepius, there's lots of manuscripts. That one almost qualifies as a medieval bestseller by virtue of having no fewer than 78 extant versions of it from the Middle Ages, as compared to the Book of Six Principles that has far fewer. The Book of 24 Philosophers has maybe 6 witnesses. So those ones were much more obscure and didn't circulate nearly as much. And in fact, there's even one copy of the Book of 24 Philosophers that is kind of scratched out, where the text, some later reader saw fit to X out that text in the manuscript, not destroy it, but merely put large sort of clear crosses over it. You can still read the text. So it's just long, straight lines that make a big X across the column of text, as if to say, you probably shouldn't read this, but I'm not going to rip it up, is the impression it gives. And there's no way of attributing intentionality beyond that to whatever that person did. And it's hard to tell when that was done too, because it's simply lines. You can't identify the date of them, but it's ink. It seems it's not a ballpoint pen, let's put it that way.
One of the reasons that, the Asclepius survives in so many manuscripts is because, of course, the church fathers mentioned it and commented on it. Doctor, do you want to touch on that?
Oh, I can happily. So Book 8 of St. Augustine's City of God contains an extensive multiple-page quotation from the Asclepius, precisely those bits that you were mentioning earlier, Dan, regarding the infusion of spirits into statues to make them foretell the future, as well as what's known as the Lament of Egypt that you mentioned, the Lament of Hermes. Augustine quotes those things in extenso in order to refute and critique them. And you also get a Latin author and close successor as Bishop of Carthage to Augustine in the name of Quod Vult Deus. Now, that individual's works circulated under the name of Augustine during the Middle Ages. Everyone thought that those writings actually belonged to Augustine. And this Quod Vult Deus mentions the Asclepius and quotes brief fragments of it, but in a very positive light, painting Hermes essentially as a pagan foreteller of Christian Trinitarianism. And so to the eyes of the medieval readers, you have St. Augustine, the critic of Hermes in the City of God, and a pseudo-Augustine, but they thought it was authentic, who was quite charitable toward this same Hermes character. So people didn't know what to do with this text. So there's an ambiguity, but there's enough positivity there that it was used fairly extensively to the point of having 78 different copies. For comparison's sake, St. Augustine's City of God, for example, survives in 800 manuscripts, which is the true bestseller of the Middle Ages. There probably only the Bible has more copies floating around. So in that sense, it's quite an important text in terms of having seen many different readers throughout the Middle Ages, and many authors quote from it, sometimes critically because they only saw the City of God critiques, some of them more charitably because they paid more attention to the pseudo-Augustine Quod Vult Deus material. So there's this ambivalence about the text that makes it remain interesting to the extent that a very dense set of glosses was applied to it, proving, first of all, that it was used for teaching. And the density of the glosses are such that it would have been a monumental work of commentary had it survived complete. As it is, and I'm talking here about the Glosae Super Trismegistum, that's part of our translation project. It comments on the first 4 of the 41 paragraphs of the Asclepius. And that commentary on those 4 initial paragraphs spans 94 pages of printed Latin. Had the whole thing survived, we'd be talking about 900 to 1,000 pages of text. But as it is, it cuts off mid-sentence and the rest of it is who knows where. It's gone, it's lost. That being said, the fact that there is only one such commentary suggests that yes, it was used in the classroom, but perhaps not extensively. Other manuscripts of the Asclepius do have marginal notes of varying density, which also represent sort of minor scale commentaries on the text and also prove that it was used in the classroom. But like I said, it was probably not very extensively used, but for a text like this one, it's remarkable that it was used at all, considering these statue making passages in it. And those are the portions of the Asclepius that overlap most closely with the practical Hermetica that we've been talking about. But it's a minor component of the whole thing, but it's there nevertheless. And we can also refer, in a sense, notionally, the theoretical Hermetica provide, to some extent, a theoretical underpinning for the functioning of the practical Hermetica in terms of the hierarchy of being that Dan was mentioning and so on. But those concepts are not exclusive to quote unquote Hermeticism either. It's a very Platonic conceptually as a body of work. But each of these texts, the only thing they truly have in common is the attribution to Hermes. There's not a lot that is fully consonant between them because they do circulate independently and unawares of each other, it seems. And that's what I mean by their separate texts. We're bringing them together in one volume because they're all attributed to Hermes, but they don't share that much in common. And only certain portions provide some measure of theoretical background to the practical Hermetica that your listenership is familiar with.
It's more a window into how Christian scholastics, let's say, perceived pagan wisdom and how they made use of it.
Yeah, that's well put.
I thought it's worth mentioning. I have a Marsilio Ficino quote here that's from his preface to his Corpus Hermeticum translation. It's part of a longer quote about Hermes Trismegistus, but this particular part is clearly talking about the Asclepius specifically. Mercurius wrote many books pertaining to the knowledge of divinity, often speaking not only as a philosopher, but as prophet. He foresaw the ruin of the old religion, the rise of the new faith, the coming of Christ, the judgment to come, the resurrection of the race, the glory of the blessed, and the torments of the damned. So right there, you have a kind of time capsule of why Marsilio Ficino thought Mercurius was a kind of prophet, because there were so many things in common between Christian religion and Hermetic teachings that he thought somehow he was endowed with this logos, and which allowed him to see all of the truths that Christianity later revealed. And so that's really why Hermes became such an important figure well before Ficino, also in the 12th century, when a lot of prophets were popping up, all kinds of different prophets, including Virgil, Merlin, and Joachim Fior, and Aquilonius, and these different figures who were, some were Christian, but some were of a more murky origins. And that was a way that medieval Christians helped to legitimize their faith, was to say that, even the wise men among the pagans can discern the truths of Christianity. And they tried to warn people in riddles or in these obscure sentences, things like we get in the Book of 24 Philosophers. And then that paved the way for the one true religion. That's really how these texts are being used.
When you were looking at all of these texts, and Dr. Porreca, you mentioned as well many manuscripts in some of these texts, what was the need to translate these texts specifically?
The story has to do with the slow evolution of the Hermes Latinus series of critical editions of the Latin texts that the Brepols publishing house has been issuing. The founder of the series, Professor Paolo Lucentini from Naples, passed away in 2011, and that he was the sort of guiding light of the entire project. It took a few years for the press to sort of elicit interest from scholars to resurrect the series. And just last year, I'm going to check what date it was published, but the Asclepius itself has seen 2019, the same year our Picatrix came out. The Asclepius came out in a proper new critical edition by Matteo Stefani. And that sort of renewal of the Latin side of the series provoked the idea that we should assemble in English those theoretical Latin Hermetica that exist. And what we're presenting here is pretty much it. That's the reason for bringing these texts in particular together, is because there aren't any others really. So that's going to be the full package all in one go, pulling together the critically edited texts that have appeared in the Hermes Latinus series and providing them for an English audience.
The Asclepius, you can find it in Brian Copenhaver's Hermetica collection at the end. And that's a good translation. It's based on Nuc Festugiaires Latin. which is good, but it was based on different collection of manuscripts. I think the new edition collates more manuscripts. The differences aren't huge, but it's a difference of perspectives, I suppose you could say. And then I think it had also been translated by G.R.S. Mead, but in a very fragmentary form, like just the introduction. It wasn't the full text. And there may have been other translators of it. They're not off the top of my head. But the main reason we're doing it is because Brepols is putting together the project, and they need a new Latin edition that speaks to the new Lucentini edition.
They need a new English version that reflects the changes that Matteo Stefani, the editor, has applied to the text by, in fact, collating not just more manuscripts, but all the manuscripts, essentially. So it's a brand new text. Like Dan was saying, it hasn't changed a whole lot, but it has changed enough to warrant a new publication of the Latin, but also a pulling together of these theoretical Hermetic texts under one roof, in one volume, by those people who have worked most closely with them over the years. I should add that there's a French translation. The Noc Festugière edition of the Asclepius comes with a French translation as well, which we consulted along the way in order to help disentangle ambiguous passages, just to see what they thought it meant and to triangulate with our take on the text as well.
Yeah, though they evidently took a lot of liberties, which not all of which we were okay with. And that's really where, the rubber hits the road translation-wise.
There are certain expressions, Latin expressions, that are ambiguous and that can afford to remain ambiguous in French, but English doesn't allow for the same kind of ambiguity in those particular instances, and that's where we had to make difficult choices.
To that point, we have a listener question for you both from Joshua, who is asking, do each of these texts present the same quote-unquote medieval worldview, unquote, or are there variations in each of these texts?
I feel like the Asclepius deals more with how God, or the One, manifests himself in the world, whereas the Book of 24 Philosophers, which of course is written some 1,000 years later, reflects more an interest in God in and of himself. So there's this clear difference between a kind of pagan worldview that produced the Asclepius and the Christian scholastic worldview that produced the Book of 24 Philosophers. Just to give somebody a taste of what the kind of content you get in the Book of 24 Philosophers is, it's stuff like God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. God is mind generating speech, maintaining continuation. God is that than which nothing better can be conceived. God is the one compared to whom substance is accident and accident is nothing. So these abstract philosophical definitions that, if you're familiar with the jargon of scholasticism, essentially, of the Latin schoolmen in the Middle Ages, then it makes sense, right? But the thing is that these are also slightly garbled. A lot of these aphorisms draw on earlier sources. So, for example, this one that I mentioned, God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere, circumference nowhere. That is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in some cases, and to Parmenides in other cases. And another one that is very popular is God is a monad begetting a monad, reflecting a single brightness in himself. So this is a definition of the Trinity, of course, and it is traditionally attributed to Hermes. So this is one of the ways in which Hermes predicted or foresaw or understood in his mind's eye the nature of the Trinity long before he had been exposed to, the Bible or Christian missionaries or anything like that. So, yeah, I think the main difference is that one is a scholastic text, whereas the other one is more of an initiatic religious text that has some philosophical contents.
I would add to that the Asclepius is a text that was written very much in a polytheistic context, but with monotheizing tendencies. And it's those tendencies that later authors picked up on and felt that made Hermes and this text in particular relevant to understanding Christianity because of those kinds of insights. By comparison, the Book of 24 Philosophers is strictly monotheistic and is, as Dan mentioned, largely the product of a medieval scholastic environment. The aphorisms themselves I think, are somewhat more perennial, but the text has the aphorisms, but has a more or less extensive commentary attached to each of them. And that commentary is strictly scholastic, to the extent that the language is so different from that of Cicero that our colleague and friend Brett Bartlett found it particularly grating, because he's accustomed to the mellifluous prose of a Cicero. And this stuff is really quite technical and jargony and theological, and the product of schoolmen for whom Latin is a second language for all of them, by definition, as compared to Cicero, who was, of course, a natural Latin speaker, and a very good one at that.
To that point, Dr. Porreca and Dan, we do have another listener question for you from Lauren, who is saying, "Hi, Dan and David. I absolutely loved your Picatrix book. It really opened my eyes to the Latin sources. I'm so excited for your translations being discussed on Glitch Bottle, as am I, Lauren. Very excited." Lauren says, "My question is, since these are theoretical texts, what evidence do we have that the practical Hermeticists used these texts and incorporated them into rituals or operations? Or instead, do these texts provide a framework for practical operations to operate within? Thank you both so much."
Definitely by the Renaissance, people like Marsilio Ficino and Campanella and these kinds of guys, Giordano Bruno presumably, were reading these texts. But I don't think that people throughout, let's say, the Middle Ages, like certainly someone like Al-Qurtubi, who wrote the Picatrix, could not have read this Asclepius text because it's Latin. So, it only survives in Latin, and only people in the Latin world would have read it. I think that texts come together in a kind of intertextual network, and they build up on each other. And there are differences across the texts, but people would debate about those. But I think it really is a vision of the Platonic cosmos, the kind of cosmos that is laid out in the Timaeus, but it is expressed in a kind of Egyptian veneer. The story clearly takes place in Egypt. The characters are Egyptian. There's a lament for, the apocalypse of Egypt. But at the same time, it's clearly a Platonic work that is talking about, the one and the many, and how the one emanates the intellectual world, and then the sensible world emanates out from that. And so you have one God and one world soul and one world. And that vision is preceded by other sources, things like the Stoic ascent narratives, or like Scipio's dream is a good example of this. We see similar kind of stuff in Macrobius. This vision of the cosmos was well known and well accepted. It was the science of the day. And I think that this is an attempt to capture all of that into one narrative, because the way that the book opens, Trismegistus says to Asclepius, you need to concentrate your mind so that you'll see that there's not just many good things, but that all these many good things are really one thing. And it's a kind of delivery of the gnosis, if you will. And what that gnosis entails is a picture of the whole cosmos. So did Hermeticists read this? I don't know, but the world that it describes is very similar to the cosmos described in the Corpus Hermeticum, or in the texts that survive that we today call the Corpus Hermeticum. And it also reflects a lot of the Gnostic worldview in some respects, but mainly the Platonic worldview laid out in the Timaeus. I think it's safe to say that it is quite similar to that world.
I would add that any users of the practical Hermetica during the Middle Ages, once those texts were translated into Latin, nothing would have prevented them, I guess, if they had access to the material, from reading these theoretical treatises. But it seems to me that the audience for each category of texts was fairly different, in that we have these theoretical texts that we're translating being read by schoolmen, essentially. And the practical material, considering the nature of the manuscripts in which they survive, it's clear that those texts are less formal in their elaboration. The manuscripts themselves are of a poor quality in terms of the penmanship and the binding and this kind of thing, broadly speaking. So one could see a theoretical backdrop in these theoretical treatises to the operations that one sees in the practical ones. But in real terms, there's nothing proves that the practitioners using the practical texts actually consulted the theoretical ones. It's kind of the theoretical material is the water in which the practitioners swim, so to speak.
Right.
That it's kind of a taken for granted intellectual ground.
And that's in the Middle Ages. When we get into the Renaissance,
Yes.
things get a little bit clearer. Like we know for a fact that Ficino read the Asclepius and knew about these passages about the animation of statues. And that's actually ties into his 3 books on life and the Apologia that he wrote at the end of it. How people are familiar, like a lot of schoolmen and high-ranking church officials, they are familiar with this text, and they're thinking, why are you so gung-ho about this Hermes figure who's a sorcerer, who talks about drawing down spirits into demons, into images. So he is very clear in his book. He's like, I'm not advocating this specific practice that is laid out in the Asclepius, but I'm more so talking about the kinds of things that are in, let's say, the Picatrix, where it's medicines and remedies for scorpion bites and the ring for life extension, these kinds of things that are benign, they're healing. And that's kind of what his magic was all about. So he picked and chose certain things that he wanted from the Hermetic tradition, and then clearly ignored others, or consciously avoided others. And I don't think Ficino is necessarily the only one. This is I think a trend in people in the Renaissance who were interested in Hermes. There's lots of debates about the primacy of Hermes in the Renaissance, and is he the font of all wisdom, like Ficino says? He's like the first of these 6 philosophers in this long chain, or is he downhill and he's just kind of an Egyptian sorcerer? And why would someone who is a follower of Moses, the prophet of prophets, who knew all about the Egyptian wisdom, why would he care about what this Egyptian sorcerer has to say? That's one kind of perspective that we see playing out in the Renaissance. But again, it's debated. There is no one view of Hermes or one acceptable narrative. There are kind of a whole bunch of different texts with different mentions of Hermes, and then people start to try to categorize them into 3 Hermes or 5 Hermeses, and it just becomes a mess. And it's funny because even if they do parse the 5 Hermeses apart, they still kind of just refer to Hermes as Hermes. They don't specify which one said what, or was an astrologer, or which one was an alchemist, or which one was a theologian. It's clear in the Asclepius that the Hermes talking is bearing the name Hermes. He is not this ancient sage from, I don't know, Atlantean times or what have you. He is just a character. I think there's a line where he talks about how he bears his grandfather's name, if I remember correctly, but I would have to find that.
You both mentioned that these texts attributed to Hermes have no extant analogs in Greek or Arabic. So maybe we can talk more about that with this next listener question for you both from Maria. And Maria is saying, so excited you both are talking about these texts on Glitch Bottle. As you both share in your Picatrix book, the Picatrix has original Arabic sources that were later translated into Latin language tributaries. You mentioned that these theoretical Hermetic texts that you're currently discussing are, quote, unique to the Latin world, but Maria is asking, did either yourself, Dr. Porreca, or Dan, did you see any evidence of borrowing Arabic ideas of theological or philosophical concepts when these works were originally composed?
There are good answers to that in the sense that the Asclepius itself started out as a Greek text, and certain portions of it survive in papyri, but not the whole thing as a unit. It's dribs and drabs here and there. There's the middle paragraphs, about 8 paragraphs from 21 to 29 roughly, survive as part of the Nag Hammadi library, which is a Gnostic library that was discovered in the 1940s and that had been buried sometime in the 3rd century. So there were Coptic speaking and writing people who were reading and copying this text from Greek into Coptic at the time. And not too long thereafter, we also get a Latin version emerging from the Greek as well. The Greek is not extant. It does not survive aside from the dribs and drabs I've been mentioning. But there are also Greek texts, what Dan has been referring to as the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a collection of dialogues, Platonic-esque dialogues, similar to the Asclepius, but surviving in Greek, but they were not known to the Latin West until they fell into Ficino's hands in the 1450s and 60s. In the wake of the Turkish takeover of Constantinople, Greek scholars fled with their books to Italy. And that's how that particular collection of Hermetic texts made it into Western Latin eyes. And it's clear from these bits that do survive, both the Asclepius and the Corpus Hermeticum, that there has to have been a much broader collection of texts attributed to Hermes that was written in and that circulated in antiquity, but very little of it survives to be studied today. There are other fragments, Hermetic fragments, that survive in the work of the Byzantine compiler known as Stobaeus. And those fragments, I call them fragments, but they're at least as long as the Corpus Hermeticum itself. But they're clearly fragments. They're bits and pieces that Stobaeus saw fit to include in his grand anthology of ancient Greek literature. There are also other testimonies to Hermes that survive in various church fathers, the writings of various church fathers, more or less extensive in terms of length. Cyril of Alexandria is one of those who quotes extensive portions from Hermetic texts, Clement of Alexandria as well. And what's really interesting is that of the evidence we have from antiquity, just about all of the authors who know of or cite Hermes are all North African. There's next to no exception, which seems to make this ancient Hermeticism a North African phenomenon, which ties well with the Egyptianizing veneer that is given to these texts in terms of the other characters in addition to Hermes are, well, Asclepius in that particular dialogue, but also 2 other Hermetic disciples in this dialogue fiction that's being presented to us, one by the name of Ammon and the other by the name of Tat. And those clearly correspond to the names of Egyptian deities. So there's this Egyptianizing veneer that is applied to the text to make it some more intriguing to its Latin and Greek audience. First Greek, then Latin. The Arabic material seems to draw on a completely different tradition. If there were ancient Hermetica that were practical, those don't survive. And if they do survive, they become what we have been describing as the Arabic tradition of the practical material.
Yeah, like the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica and the Book of the Pure Good and these kinds of traditions which flow out of Plotinus and Proclus. And then you have the Sabian material and the Nabatean material and all of that stuff. But yeah, none of this stuff figures in the Asclepius or in the Book of 24 Philosophers. It's as if those 2 traditions didn't know each other at all.
You know, you both touched on this earlier in terms of the differences between the texts and the outlook. We do have a listener question for you both from Richard. And Richard is saying, how wonderful 2 luminaries are pushing the boundaries on the known sphere of Latin texts into English. My question, Richard says, is, do these texts show an evolution in thought on the central question, quid est Deus? Does the emphasis change over time on this question, or are the resounding themes pretty consistent?
So for this question, we'd have to ask, are we talking about just the Book of 24 Philosophers which is dealing with this specific question, or are we talking about all the works? Because again, as we mentioned, they're not terribly connected other than the fact that they're both attributed to Hermes. I would say in the Book of 24 Philosophers, you don't really see an evolution so much as you just see a great variety, many possible definitions of God, and then little commentaries as to what those definitions are. So one would be, God is that from which whatever is without partition, that through which whatever is without variation, that in which what is without mixture. Or how about, God is he who is known in the mind only by an unknowing. So that's that apophatic negative theology tradition. To me, this all strikes as very Proclean. So I would say that if you read Proclus, you would probably get a more in-depth vision of what is going on here. But this is more of a collection of lots of different aphorisms from different philosophers, again, ranging from Hermes to Parmenides to Proclus. Yeah, in brief, I don't see necessarily an evolution so much as a great variety. They don't seem to be like building on each other or ascending in any manner. Each definition is, I think, as valid as another.
Because these texts are basically independent from each other, there can't really be an evolution from one to the next. They kind of each stand alone. The only link between any of them is the attribution to Hermes. And also, to be fair, the glosses, the glossae super Trismegistum is a gloss on the Asclepius. So you have the content of the Asclepius that appears in all these other manuscripts, and you have this particular gloss, which is one medieval scholastic's interpretation of those 4 paragraphs. So it's not an evolution in the thinking of any given individual. It's just interpretations that span multiple centuries here. And we happen to get like 4 little snapshots, one of them from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and a handful of others from the 12th century. The Book of 24 Philosophers is described as a sort of garbled condensation of certain portions of Proclus, and Dan's description matches that interpretation quite neatly, in that there have been 2 prominent editors of the Latin text, François Udry and Paolo Lucentini, and I forget which one posits an late antique Alexandrian origin to these texts, which would be consonant with what Proclus would have thought. And I forget which of the 2 editors takes that point of view, but it's one or the other. And the other argues that it's strictly a 12th century invention. So the jury's out on that. And there's not really enough evidence to make a reasonable call either way. And so I'm not willing to jump on either side of that fence, to be honest. So, but in terms of evolution, instead of any kind of traceable evolution, we get snapshots, I would say.
Yeah, and we also get this interesting thing. So in the Book of 24 Philosophers, we have the main text and commentary, and then we have, again, 2 commentaries on that.
Yeah.
And those commentaries are interesting because they're kind of like self-reflexive on the Platonic tradition, in that they'll cite various authors like Cicero or Aristotle or Averroes, and they cite all kinds of authors borrowing from their particular philosophies in an attempt to explain these obscure sentences. I find some of the stuff is not terribly enlightening, but some of the stuff is quite interesting.
And I should add that there is, among the commentaries accompanying the Book of 24 Philosophers, well, not accompanying, but commentaries on it that circulates completely independently, is the 13th century English Franciscan known as Thomas of York, who writes an enormous theological treatise entitled Sapientiale, and several paragraphs, several pages of text, in fact, in that book comment explicitly on several of the definitions from the Book of 24 Philosophers. So it's clear that at least Thomas of York was actively reading and thinking about this text. He's also the author from the Middle Ages who cites Hermes the most by a substantial measure. So he's one of the major interpreters of Hermes in the Middle Ages, and Dionysius, but is an otherwise unremarkable Franciscan from the 13th century. whose work didn't circulate very much at all. There are only 3 extant copies of the Sapientiale that survive, for example. But that text, at the very least, was used by a 14th century Dominican by the name of Berthold of Moosburg, who also cites Hermes a great deal, but most of the time through Thomas of York. So once again, we're in the presence of snapshots of interpretation that span multiple centuries. And it's hard to speak of an evolution when you have only single iterations and instances of interpretation.
It's notable that Berthold of Moosburg also, I think, translated the Elements of Theology by Proclus.
Yes, exactly. And it's in the context of that particular treatise that he borrows extended extracts from Thomas. These various commentaries on and readings on regarding the Book of 24 Philosophers, Dan used the word turgid earlier, and really the style in which this material is written is difficult for a modern audience, I should say, to follow and swallow, because it is medieval scholastic abstract thinking, and we're totally not accustomed to thinking along those lines today at all. And it's sometimes a bit of a slog, to be perfectly frank.
So given this excellent context that you both are providing, many listeners of the podcasts are out there who perhaps practice practical Hermeticism or perhaps ceremonial magic. And they're hearing, okay, these texts, the theoretical and the practical, didn't, circulate together for the most part, but they might still be wondering, well, what can I take away from this excellent theoretical framework on a practical level, even though it didn't circulate together? And to that point, we have a listener question for both of you from Callie. And Callie is asking and saying, I love poring over newly translated source works, and so I cannot wait to get my hands on a copy of your upcoming book. And Callie is asking, my question is, as a practicing magician, what should I take away from these texts? Or rather, how should these texts inform my practice of medieval grimoire magical texts?
I think probably the text for you out of this collection then is the Asclepius.
Yeah.
And particularly the passages that became popular throughout history for a lot of practicing magicians was the sections on God making, the idea being that mankind is in a way divine, and in the way that God makes man makes gods, and he reveals them. I would have to find the quote, but they're described as like the heads. The statue, the physical manifestation of the visible God, is described as like the head of the being that juts out at you. But then there's, of course, this whole body that is behind the head of the idol or the image. And I think that practical magicians would get the most out of reading these passages carefully, because they are not necessarily the same as talismanic magic, but there are certain precursors, I guess you could say, to talismanic magic in these practices, and certain similarities, especially on a cosmological level, like how this is all thought to play out in the metaphysical guts of the operations. So I think the sections on statues and also just the bits on cosmology in general are interesting. And likewise, it's just an interesting read from the perspective of the history of esotericism, in the sense of this didactic hiding and revealing that is going on between the master Hermes and his students who are listening to his dialogue.
I would add also that the very end of the Asclepius, I want to preface my comments here with a broader description of the contents and the layout of this text. It's presented as a dialogue between Hermes, the master, and 3 disciples, the principal interlocutor of whom is Asclepius. And during their discussion, and it's analogous to Plato's dialogues in terms of it being a fictionalized dialogue for literary form purposes, along the way, they touch on various topics from those we've been discussing, the infusion of spirits into statues, but they also discuss the fate of evil souls after death. They discuss whether or not there exists a void or a vacuum.
Mhm.
They touch on the distinction between genera and species, or types and kinds, if you will, how to categorize things, the place of humans, of man in the cosmic scheme, and that man is exceptional as being a perfectible being, that a man is different from the rest of physical creation by virtue of his perfectibility and can become akin to the gods if they devote their mind to the task. And at the end of the dialogue, and this is what I'm getting at, there is a prayer of thanksgiving. And that is one of the sections of the text that also survives in an early version in Greek. A first century AD papyrus contains that particular text, in addition to it appearing in the Asclepius. That's another bit that I would pay attention to, because in these kinds of operations, I suspect that an attitude of gratitude toward existence, broadly speaking, is more likely to lead to success than otherwise.
Yeah.
So I would pay attention to the prayer of thanksgiving as well.
I wanted to expand on that because that is something that is quite a wrench in the spokes of the practical Hermetic tradition. And that is to say, at the end of the Asclepius, when we think of Hermeticism, we often think of things like theurgy and magic and astral magic, talismans, this sort of thing, unless we're thinking about the theoretical material, of course. But in the Asclepius, right at the end, there's a part where the disciples ask Hermes, should we be attending our prayer with incense? And Hermes is actually like shocked and aghast by this question. And he says, no, like, why would you sacrifice anything to the all who is the all? Like, he already is the all. So what can you give to him that he doesn't already have? All he needs is your gratitude. And this is a very much runs contrary to a lot of the what we would call more magical operations, stuff like we find in the Picatrix, where people are doing suffumigations, doing sacrifices, consecrating talismans, calling on the sensible gods, things like that. Whereas the conclusion in this is that God doesn't want any of that stuff, which is quite contrary to what we get in a lot of other texts. So I just wanted to highlight that there's kind of an internal tension within Hermeticism. And the other thing is that the very, very, very last thing mentioned in the dialogue is that they sit down to have a meal together without animals. So no flesh. And I feel like that is probably quite an important aspect of this, that, what they're saying piety is a kind of anti-religion, no incense, no sacrifices, only gratitude, like only the contemplation of the pure mind, and vegetarianism. So it sounds almost Pythagorean in nature, but that is the nature of this Hermetic text. And it clashes quite significantly with what we would find in other traditional Hermetic magical practices.
This actually leads Dr. Porreca and Dan to a question that I know we've discussed, Dan, before, especially when tackling, big projects, translation projects. But could both of you share a little bit about what were some beliefs or perhaps academic assumptions or otherwise that you both might have had before you were going into this translation project with the rest of your colleagues that maybe were changed or challenged on the other side? Or what were some of the main surprises that you might have both had coming into this project, or unexpected twists and turns of translating? Or is there anything that changed or that was unexpected from before you started to where you are now?
Personally speaking, things were pretty straightforward, if you ask me. We had been well primed from translating Ficino to just carry on and bite things off a little bit at a time. You always have to go back on your work and especially with certain thematic words, as words are used in a number of different contexts, you get a sense for what that word means, and you've got to go back over your work. But there weren't too many surprises or anything like that to me. I suppose one thing that was new to me was this idea that the Apuleius affair, of why is this attributed to pseudo Apuleius? And it turns out that there's, a chain of scholars who argued that in style, in his Latin style, this is very similar to Apuleius, the author of the Metamorphosis, which of course has that long passage about the mysteries of Isis and being initiated into the mysteries of Isis and having his out-of-body ecstatic experience and all that. So people assumed, the author who wrote this, who's a famous magician in antiquity, he must be responsible for translating this work out of Greek into Latin. And then other scholars pushed back on that, saying, no, it's not Apuleius. It's a much later, I think, 4th century author. There's never really been any consensus on that, so people just settle on pseudo Apuleius. And that was new to me. I had never known that this text was attributed to a pseudo Apuleius. But Doctor, perhaps you have some surprises.
Well, the text has been traditionally attributed to Apuleius going all the way back to the Middle Ages because it circulates in manuscript form along with Apuleius's philosophical shorter treatises. De Deus Socrates, on the god of Socrates, and De Platone and De Mundo are all treatises that are short and philosophical, theoretical. They're not like the Metamorphoses, that is a full-scale novel of fiction. And on account of the association with Apuleius's legitimate texts, I think people got the idea that he may well have been the translator. And in style, as Dan was mentioning, there are some resemblances, but it doesn't necessarily imply a one-to-one link, because my suspicion is that it's simply a North African style, which kind of overlaps with what I was observing earlier regarding the almost exclusively North African awareness of the Hermetic texts, broadly speaking. Those authors that cite Hermes from antiquity are almost all from North Africa, and almost nobody from elsewhere cites them as well. So the fact that Apuleius himself is North African and was trained in his writing in the schools there and so on suggests that there's simply a common sense of style that is North African in terms of Latin that sort of lies in the background both to Apuleius and to the Asclepius. That being said, we know that the Asclepius has to have been translated sometime between the church father Lactantius, who is a contemporary of the Emperor Constantine. And when he quotes from this text, he quotes the original Greek. And in Lactantius is where we find fragments of the original Greek of this text. And so there are a few instances where we can triangulate between the Latin that survives complete and those bits and pieces that he translates. So fast forward from Lactantius, who's using the Greek, to St. Augustine writing the City of God sometime in the 14s, in the sense that the second decade of the 5th century. Between those instances is when the Latin was produced, because Augustine uses the Latin that we have. So it can't have been Apuleius, who was a 2nd century figure, but the style is consonant, and so it's no accident that it would have been attributed. Now, getting to the surprise factor, I mean, I had been working on these texts for 20, 25 years at this point, so there's not a lot that comes as a surprise anymore. What did surprise me is how much fun I had working on this stuff with Dan and with Brett along the way. And so it's working throughout the pandemic every day, a few hours was invariably the highlight of my day, pretty much. So, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work with such diligent colleagues who are willing to do the everyday thing and make it a pleasant routine. And it seems as though it's a very good way to get things done that stay done at the end of the day, unlike the dishes, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 hours a day and you can get quite a lot done. Like that's a lot of erosion on a project if you're consistent.
When I hear that you two, it's two people have such a deep knowledge of these texts and you're collaborating together, in my head, you're meeting secretly at midnight in some monastery during a thunderstorm, and Dr. Porreca has a candle and he's leading slowly down this labyrinth to some dark, cavernous underground secret library, and then Dan's there, and then you open this giant parchment book and you start with these quills and right, like this is how. But then I remember, oh yeah, we're during a pandemic right now, and like, how did you collaborate during COVID and get into all of these deep back and forth and comparisons and discussions? Can you share about that?
It's far less exciting.
Mhm.
It is just, we use Discord to speak to each other through a microphone, and you can drag and drop photos or definitions from a dictionary or what have you into the chat box, and then we use Google Docs to see what we're typing. You type up all the Latin and get all the Latin in one column on the left hand side, and then you get your English in another column on your right hand side, and you just go. And like, been doing this for a while, so sometimes it goes very smoothly and fast, but then very often you run into words that are familiar but that don't have the same usage in the 12th century, let's say, that they do in the 2nd century. So we've got to be using different dictionaries, one for classical Latin, one for, let's say, 12th century Latin. In this case, we use the Thomas Aquinas dictionary, which is 13th century, but it gives you a closer approximation of what people meant when they used those words in the Middle Ages than how they meant them when they used them in the classical world. That's it. No spooky staircases, unfortunately. Well, I don't know. Doctor's house kind of looks a bit like that. It's kind of like a spooky nightmare house.
Credit to my wife on that one.
Yeah. He likes to decorate as if it's Halloween all year round, and Doctor obliges that. And so, yeah, that's the spooky house is Doctor's house. It's not mine.
The artificial bats that dangle from our ceiling get little Santa hats at Christmas time.
That's lovely.
Yeah. And so we would just work every morning, usually like first thing in the morning when you're fresh. And then once that's out of the way, 2 hours goes by pretty quickly. If you just do that for a year or two, you'll have a book or two by the end of it.
Can you both kind of share what are 2 or 3 things that listeners and readers should always remember about either practical Hermetic texts or theoretical Hermetic texts in general when they eventually pick up a copy of your book? Or, asked in the negative, what are 2 or 3 misconceptions that people usually always have about theoretical Hermetica that perhaps they can place aside and reconsider?
The thing to keep in mind is that this is not a consciously coherent tradition. The thing that these texts share in common is their attribution to Hermes and not much else. And there are plenty of similar texts that are similar in terms of content, especially when it comes to the practical Hermetica. What distinguishes practical Hermetica from other random astrological or alchemical or magical texts? What distinguishes them is simply the fact that they are attributed to Hermes and those other texts aren't. You could put a Hermetic treatise of practical astrology next to a non-Hermetic one, and their contents are broadly speaking very similar. So the notion that there is a common thread of Hermeticism that runs through the ages is a misconception, I would say. First and foremost, that's my first reaction to that question. Dan, I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would just elaborate to say, this is an audience of magicians. And so admittedly, there is very little magic in these texts. I would say read them as a person interested in ancient religion, in medieval philosophy, but don't read them necessarily as a person trying to get any kind of ritual instructions or knowledge on how to improve your spiritual practice necessarily. I feel like this is a more of an important work historically than it is for personal development. So I think that that's probably a good caveat.
Dr. Porreca and Dan, can you share with us about, as you mentioned, 2022, later in 2022 is when people will likely be able to get a copy in their hands, but where can people stay tuned for details on the book, or if they can pre-order or perhaps check things out later on? Is there any information that you'd like to share?
Well, the book is being published by Breppels, so I would assume that they will be advertising for it. I would expect to see it out at a best guess at the very end of 2022 or the beginning of 2023. I don't know about any pre-ordering because it's just too early in the process, but I think we have to have things submitted by the summer, and then they'll undergo the peer review process, and then they'll be published and available to people. And that'll be just another work in the great collection of Hermetic texts that we have. So, the way I like to think of it is you've got Brian Copenhaver's Hermetica, which is great, the Corpus Hermeticum. And then you've got the Hermetica 2 by Litwa, which has the Stobaean fragments and all kinds of extra fragments. And then we'll have this collection as well on top of that. So then that'll be a handful yet again of more texts attributed to Hermes. So that'll kind of like tie up everything nicely with a bow, I think.
In terms of additional context, the Hermes Latinus project or series of books aims to edit all of the Latin Hermetica in critical editions, and Breppels runs a parallel series of translations from their critical edition series, and it's in that series that our book of translations is going to fit. So that's the sort of broader publication context of this book and how it'll appear. Like as Dan said, our deadline is August of next year. We're also in charge of translating from Italian into English the introduction that Matteo Stefani is writing that's going to cover the theoretical material relating to the Asclepius in particular. It's going to be penned in Italian, and we're translating it into English, and as well as providing our own sort of translator's notes to the introduction as well. The translations will not be appearing simply raw without any interpretation. There will be interpretive text there that will also represent the collaborative effort. And Mark Delp will be doing the same for his section on the Liber de Sex Rerum Principis. So it should make for a decent package altogether.
Can you give us any hints on perhaps other collaborative projects or other individual projects or research or areas that you're looking into that you'd just like to let the listeners know about that they can also stay tuned for in the coming months?
So in the meantime, I've been working on, and we actually started this before the Asclepius, but shifted over from this project. The author I'm working on is a 16th century Franciscan Kabbalist named Arcangelo of Borgo Novo. And he wrote a scholarly defense of Pico della Mirandola's Kabbalistic theses. So Pico della Mirandola was excommunicated for his 13 of his 900 theses. And one of the guys responsible for excommunicating him was a Dominican named Pedro Garcia. And so Arcangelo writes a defense against Pedro Garcia in defense of Pico and explaining his rather small and not very detailed sentences, his thoughts on Kabbalah, and he expands them like quite elaborately. This is a big book. It's something like 400, 500 pages. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm just in the process of transcribing it, and the text is printed, which makes it a lot easier to read than manuscript, but it's still kind of blotchy and it's riddled with abbreviations, not all of which are immediately apparent. A lot of them I learned in Dr. Porreca's paleography class. And so, a lot of them I just have down, and when I read them, my brain just fills in the gaps. But there are a few that I don't fully know, and I've got to look them up. But yeah, so that's interesting. Just a Christian Kabbalah from the 16th century, very analogous to the kinds of stuff that you read in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, because contemporaneous, first off. And second of all, they're both rooted in Francesco Giorgi's De Harmonia Mundi, which is a very important work of Christian Kabbalah that came in the, following Pico's time. And that's a common source for both Agrippa and for Reuchlin, I believe, also inspired it. And so you get this whole chain of Christian Kabbalists from Pico to Reuchlin to Francesco Giorgi to Arcangelo of Borgonovo. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now in the meantime. And this is a project that I started with Dr. Porreca and with Brett. We started translating the Apologia before we moved over to the Asclepius, because we were just fresh from doing Marsilio Ficino and translating his biblical polemics, basically, which are not exactly Kabbalistic, but engage in invectives against Talmudists and things like that. So I've been trying to work on my Hebrew, and that's been kind of an interesting journey. I also started working on Arabic a little bit more, so both Hebrew and Arabic at the same time. And that's more or less what's going on with me. I don't know about you, Doctor, if you have any side projects.
Well, the one side project that we also collaborated on, and we're still sort of fishing around for a publisher for it, is a 16th century astrologically themed board game that was designed by one William Fulk of the University of Cambridge. And it presents the astrological answer to chess, where each player plays on a 3-foot diameter circular board that represents the zodiac, each of the 7 planets and their various astrological dignities and so on. And by moving the planets around the board, you create angles of interaction between the planets whereby the pieces can take each other and that kind of thing. So it was a board game designed to teach university medical students the art of astrology, and it does a pretty good job of it. And the same author did the equivalent, but for geometry, 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional geometry. We've translated, the three of us, Brett, Dan, and myself, the astrology game, and we are poised to undertake the geometry one once we find a place to publish this stuff. We have a few feelers out, but we're still waiting to hear back.
Anything else that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Well, there's one tidbit that we haven't mentioned at all, is that in addition to the Corpus Hermeticum that survives in Greek that landed in the hands of Marsilio Ficino, in addition to the Asclepius, in addition to the other treatises we are translating, in addition to the Stobaeus fragments and all the rest, there is also an Armenian text attributed to Hermes that dates to the early 6th century and that survives. There's an English translation of it by Jean-Pierre Mahé, a French scholar based in Paris. So that kind of completes the picture in terms of what we know of ancient Hermetica, because the Armenian culture saw a substantial flourishing right around that time, which is when this text was copied. It is thematically consistent with the rest of the Hermetic treatises and represents another kind of branch of ancient Hermetica that is somewhat understudied, considering the linguistic challenge. There are fewer people who know ancient Armenian than those who know Latin or ancient Greek. So we're fortunate that Professor Mahé has done the work he has on this. He's the discoverer of the text in the first place, pretty much, or the one who actually at least brought it to a Western audience for the first time, because there were a couple of Russian publications about it back in the 50s. But just in order to provide you with the complete picture, there's also this Armenian material that's out there.
Wonderful collaboration, wonderful partnership. Dan Attrell, intellectual historian, classicist, and doctoral candidate in medieval and Renaissance history at the University of Waterloo, also known as the Modern Hermeticist, of course, along with his co-translator and doctoral supervisor, Dr. David Porreca, who is Associate Professor of Classics and co-director of the Medieval Studies program at the University of Waterloo and a specialist in Latin Hermetica. Dan and Dr. Porreca, just thank you both so much for sharing your time and your wisdom on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us, Alex. It's always a pleasure.
Very much so. It's been a pleasure.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought Dan Attrell and Dr. David Porreca did such an amazing job laying out the importance of these new translations and what theoretical Hermetica is all about. So often, I know for myself, I might be caught up in the practical Hermetic side of things and looking at ways to incorporate practical Hermetica with magical procedures, all of which is very important. However, theoretical Hermetica lays this broader circumference, this broader worldview and worldviews and complexity and differences and cross-pollination and this giant sphere in which theoretical Hermetica has a place, but also the larger philosophical questions that are so important to giving that extra context. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Check out the links below. And also, thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your amazing support. Did I mention that Glitch Bottle has no sponsors and no advertisements to support it? Literally, only you, only listener support. That's the only reason why the podcast is possible. And so if you'd like to claim your seat on the Glitch Bottle Caravan and enjoy extra perks and benefits, please visit patreon.com/glitchbottle. And you can always subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.